Welcome to the first episode of the Open Door podcast, where we explore issues surrounding cultural identity with people of different ethnic and professional backgrounds. My name is Patrick.
And my name is Anthony. In this episode, we had the pleasure of talking with Reverend Mark Nam. He is one of the first British-born Chinese priests in the history of the Church of England. He was ordained at Bristol Cathedral in October 2020.
Yeah, I was particularly looking forward to this episode because Anthony and I are both agnostic, so our identities have had little to no religious influence, right? Would you say that?
I agree. So it was fascinating to hear from someone who was called by God to embrace all of himself. We discussed his transition from law to religion, studying theology, and his cultural identity within the context of God.
Timestamps are in the description if you want to skip forward to any particular parts, but without further ado, this is Reverend Mark Nam.
How does it feel to be one of the first British-born Chinese priests in the history of the Church of England?
Pretty mixed, to be honest. On the one hand, it does feel quite exciting to be amongst one of the first in the UK, representing British Chinese in leadership. And it's not only the Church of England, but also the entire Anglican communion globally. So that's pretty exciting. Now, of course, there are priests who are Chinese, and sometimes they come over to the UK for a period. But to have one who is BBC, British-born Chinese, I think is quite significant. But on the other hand, it is also quite sad to think that in all of this time, there hasn't been any or hardly any British Chinese clergy in the Church of England. When I began what was known as the discernment process, so this is where you start exploring the idea of ordination, okay? It became apparent that there were no other Chinese clergy around. And even after asking my diocese, so there are 42 dioceses across the UK, all right, and making inquiries even with the Archbishop's office in London, at the time no one could find any. So you can imagine that I actually felt pretty lonely, even isolated.
Do you know the reason why there were so few?
Yeah, there are a number of reasons. I think in terms of being a minority group, the Chinese isn't necessarily the largest. When you look back at the history of when those who are Chinese came over, they came over in small amounts and we often separated ourselves so we didn't stand on each other's turf for business. It was very pragmatic. So there's few Chinese and we're quite spread out. So the communities didn't necessarily proliferate quite widely. And so when you're thinking of a national church, yeah, there aren't many Chinese who have necessarily gone for it. I think as well, when you think about migration, looking to be part of the church might not be seen by your parents as a worthwhile occupation or whatever. So I think there's a good number of reasons why there aren't many Chinese clergy. And of course, there is things like institutional racism as well within all sectors of society, including the church.
Right, yeah. And have you experienced any racism at all from the church? You know, whether or not it was subtle or quite overt?
Yeah, that's a good question. On a personal level, I don't think I haven't really encountered much overt racism or prejudice, or anyone trying to block me per se in becoming ordained. And I guess the experience is different depending on which diocese you're exploring ordination with. So my experience with Bristol diocese has been very positive. However, in terms of other resistance, I have had friends, interestingly, outside the Church of England questioning my decision. It's done in love, but a few people have rightfully pointed out the institution might be racist, we don't see many Chinese in it, so why are you going for this? Why are you setting yourself up to get hurt? There's a really good book out there called Ghost Ship. It's written by an author who likens the Church of England to a ship, and the people at the bottom of the ship are the slaves, right? So people who are black and brown skinned. And when a ship sinks, so the author's arguing if a ship is sinking a bit, the first people to drown are the people of black and brown skin. And I have a good number of friends just warning me, saying, do you really know what you're getting yourself into? And as we mentioned, it's no secret that there's little BAME representation in the C of E. It is slowly getting better. So yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Was it your friends or your family that warned you against this outside of England? Not warned you, but gave you advice to not to go into it.
Mostly friends. So prior to being part of the Church of England, so when I was growing up in university, I used to attend a Chinese church in Cardiff. So there are a number of Chinese churches around the UK, and they have English-speaking sections and things. And I think, yeah, some of my friends are very supportive. Rightfully, they're wondering, can you really have an impact in the Church of England, in the national church? And I think these are valid questions because, as you said, we don't see many Chinese faces within the established church. And so in some ways, being amongst the first, I do feel in some ways that I'm blazing a trail a little bit. I don't have other people of Chinese heritage to really look to. And in fact, as part of my story, when I was going through a discernment process and I couldn't find someone, eventually my own father said he knew a Chinese priest who was due to retire. And I got in touch with him. His name is Wingman. Down south, he's in Portsmouth now. So he was a bit of an example to me, but I had to go to the history books. And I found that in the 1940s, the first ordained woman in the entire Anglican Communion, so not just England, the first woman who was ordained as a minister in the church was from Hong Kong. Her name is Florence Lei Tim Oi, and during or just after the war, the Archbishop in Hong Kong needed more priests. They just didn't have enough. And he ordained her as a woman, which was a big no-no back then, really, right? The ordination of women. So she was a pioneer. You know, I just think it's beautiful that someone from Hong Kong was a pioneer in bringing equality to women within the church. And all these years later, again, I'm someone who has a real affinity to Hong Kong. I'm getting to hopefully pioneer or push forward new ground for others like ourselves.
So when you were meeting, can you tell us more about the meeting with Wingman in Portsmouth?
Yeah,
what was that like?
It was like a blind date, wasn't it? My family and I drove down. It was in the summer. It was really hot and our aircon had failed. I remember that. But it was lovely. Wingman was still working. He's a team vicar, so he looks over a number of other clergy. And we just stayed a few days at his home with his wife, Colleen, who's from Ireland. And really, it felt like I'd found a mentor. I'd found someone who could understand my experiences. And when you go through the discernment process to become potentially a priest, it's very rigorous. It has to be. Okay? And so it can be from anywhere from 6 months to 3 years. And it's very personal. They look at culture, they look at your history, they look at references. Yeah, very rigorous. And when I was going through that process, I wasn't sure how much of my culture do I bring to bear? Do they understand? Do I need to not cover it up, but how do I communicate it to a predominantly white British organization? So having someone like Wingman there just to discuss this with and bounce these ideas off and to pull from his experience was really valuable. And I really needed that. And it's my hope that in the future East Asian or Chinese ordinands will be able to connect to people like myself and Wingman and others for that support. The funny thing is, after we left him, a couple of months later, he calls me up and he's like, Mark, I really felt in some ways that you coming to me was of God. And he goes, and I now feel like now's a good time to retire. So I'm like, oh, great, one in, one out. But obviously, when you're in ministry, retiring doesn't really mean retiring from, kingdom work, you'd call it. And
Sure.
he's very much involved in speaking into my life and the lives of a few others I've actually been able to connect with in the last couple of years.
So you mentioned that this process can take up to 3 years. Is that like an extreme example, or is that quite common that it can take 3 years for this?
I think, according to the literature you find online, the average is around 2 years. When you sense a calling on your life to serve in the church, to serve the people of God, so to speak, you approach probably your vicar of your church, and they have discussions with you, and then they refer you to your diocese. And it's there that you have people who explore your vocation with you. So you attend a course for a number of months, you meet up with your director of ordinands, your DDO, or your assistant DDO. Sometimes you might take a psychometric test, I'm not kidding.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes you might need to spend time with other clergy in different traditions of the church. So the church is beautifully broad. You have very high church, Anglo-Catholic with lots of liturgy and tradition. But then you have what's known as low church, where it's a lot more informal. And if you're training to serve within the church, a large church, you need to understand and be familiar with all of these different traditions, all of these expressions of worship, all of these contexts. And so that's why it takes so long to prepare you through a discernment process. And even then, you then have to go to a BAP, which stands for Bishop's Advisory Panel. And I was away for a few days, basically under observance, taking interviews with different people with different interests in the church. Very rigorous, but I would say really very essential. Yeah.
Personally, for you, was this process quite difficult, or did you find it fairly easy?
This is where I think being British Chinese and having a hybrid identity is quite interesting, where it comes to bear on this. Because on the one hand, I think I have learnt as a British Chinese to adapt, to assimilate. You learn how to give the answers that the person asking is looking for. It's part of a survival technique, really, of being a minority. So you have that on one hand, and yet on the other, I want to be authentic. I want to be real and true. And so there's this tension between these two. And so the difficulty was in navigating this, because I didn't want to be inauthentic and just bring a good surface person. So yeah, it was challenging. And as I was going through this, I needed someone like Wingman to help affirm me, give me confidence to do that. And actually, I've been on a journey of embracing, I think, who I really am, rather than continuing just to be who I think I should be to fit in.
So just to clarify, the discernment process is the one after your theology degree. It's an additional phase.
Yeah, it's a separate phase, additional phase.
Separate phase. Yeah.
Now, for me, I'd already begun some theological training. So you can be studying theology and you're not intending to be part of a Church of England. You could be doing it because you want to be an academic, a professor, cultural studies, whatever. But usually people go through the discernment process first, and if they get approved, or recommended, sorry, not approved. If they get recommended, your diocese will then contribute to some of your studies. So most people do it that way.
Oh, I see.
My story was a bit different because I came from Hong Kong. I was working in Hong Kong prior, and I just felt I needed theological study. I had no intentions or aspirations to be part of the Church of England. But it was during my first 2 years of study, which I paid for myself, that I began exploring ordination. And then it was for the subsequent 2 years that then they supported my training. So I went from doing a BA to an MA, which is really good.
Can you elaborate more on what you study in theology? So can you give us a sense of what the course entails?
Well, there are different kind of areas. There's biblical studies. Christians would generally agree that God's intention for us is through his word. So there's biblical studies, hermeneutics, and you learn how to interpret it well and not do it badly where you abuse it and abuse people because of it. Then you have things like doctrine is the study of God himself. So you're looking at who is God? What is God? What is humanity? It's existential kind of things to make sense of the world. But then theology isn't just all of this lofty intellectual stuff. It has to be very practical. So then you have studies in ethics. So you're looking at how does biblical hermeneutics and understanding of doctrine impact how you make, moral choices. Things like, I don't know, eugenics or AI or poverty or justice and things like that. Then, of course, if you're training to be a priest like myself, you have pastoral modules. How do you pastor people, all sorts, men, women, children, but also mental issues. How do you do life stage as well? Birth, baptism, funerals, cradle to the grave. And then there's so many more. There's soteriology, study of the spirit, of other religions. And of course, then contemporary stuff like justice and race and so forth. But really, you want to get a good, balanced kind of education in these things to equip you to serve God's people better. Yeah.
So was it mostly Christian theology? Because you said there was like some spiritual stuff and you learned about other religions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the the core beliefs in Christianity is that God became incarnate. He became flesh to come into the world. It's very important that we study and are aware of the world and the cultures that are in it. And I think historically, the church, so to speak, has been very condescending, very arrogant of other cultures. You think about how Christianity spread. When it spread from the West, it was very much linked with colonial expansion. So it was a bit messy, wasn't it? And you would go somewhere and say, you can't be Christian unless you take on some of our moral Western values. Can you see how they're mixed up? And so there's a lot of theology called post-colonial theology, and it's critiquing this and seeing what was wrong with it. And actually, we need to revisit other cultures and recognize and see the beauty of what God has made and deposited in other people's languages, cultures, heritages. And instead of throwing it out, actually asking, where is God moving in that?
Okay, interesting. So what you're saying is that God has created these other religions for a purpose, and you're trying to understand the meaning in that. Is that right?
This is a real area of contention. There are different perspectives, but when we look at what Jesus did, and of course Jesus is very central to the Christian faith, the understanding I would suggest is that he came to reorientate humanity so that we face God, all right? That we engage with God. Now notice the word is reorientating. He doesn't replace us. He doesn't say, okay, you're rubbish, and throw you away, and then put in a new person, all right? And so taking that idea, I could be going to China, for example, and there's someone who has had a Confucian-influenced upbringing. Now, I don't think God is going to say, right, I need to obliterate that, destroy that, and turn you into Greco-Roman or Western philosophized person to be with me. It's saying, I need to reorientate you. You get to hold on to and still inhabit your culture, but I transform your heart. It's a bit more subtle. And put it this way, when we're trying to think of the divine things, the spiritual, we need assistance. We need things like music and symbols, liturgy to get there. Now, if you reach out to someone and you say, I want you to think about these things, but I'm going to remove all of your symbolism and rituals, you're basically preventing that person from, you're taking away their vocabulary, their only frame of reference to be able to think about things like God and life. And so it's very important that we respect other cultures, other residues of culture, so that people can, on their journey, engage with God. And I think Jesus, when he came, was hoping to reorientate us so that we would engage with God and find connection there. That's it in a nutshell, but it's a very massive, broad area.
No, definitely. Yeah, I figured. Because that degree took you 4 years, right?
Yeah, 2 years I did the undergrad, and then I jumped up onto the MA, and I got to do that in 2 years, which is a bit of a luxury. Normally it's 1 year, but I was able to spread it out and really focus on my dissertation.
What about your classmates? Did they have the same aspirations to priesthood?
Yeah, so the college that I was at was predominantly ordinands. There were a few independent students, so people, who were just studying theology and were going to take it elsewhere. But most of them are ordinands. I think what's interesting though is because I'm Chinese, and there's hardly any diversity, racial diversity. Some of the things that I was reflecting upon and thinking about, maybe my colleagues weren't, and so I didn't have the luxury to be able to discuss some of these ideas. Some of the things we just talked about just then doesn't get talked about much, right? Because it's mostly a white predominant kind of class and white normative values, white concerns. And so my hope in theological education is that there would be more representation and diversity so that we start discussing these things. The UK is becoming more multicultural, fact. So we need to be broadening our horizons and discussing some of these issues, because these are going to be really relevant in subsequent generations.
And is being a priest the end goal for you, or do you have further plans to go up in your career?
That's a really interesting question. Is it an end goal? And was it intend to move up? Because
intend to move up, yeah.
Yeah, I think your question is interesting because it presupposes a very secular view of progression. And I think that works definitely in the workplace. But when it comes to perhaps what I'm doing, which I would refer to more as a calling rather than a career, a vocation, I don't think you can use the same metrics to measure success. So I don't think myself or really any of my peers would be thinking like, okay, I'm going to be a priest and then I'm going to maybe try and be like an archdeacon and then be a bishop. That I can honestly say in the years that I've been involved in this, there's very little talk of kind of career progression. I think, I'll speak for myself, I decided to go for ordination because I felt called to serve people. And so that's where my focus is. And so how I do that doesn't really matter. So the interesting thing is, when I'm ordained priest, I'm a priest, and that kind of stays with me. Okay. But my job title can change. One day I might be a vicar. One day I might be a chaplain, in the Navy, or one day I could be a bishop. But that doesn't really matter. That's just your job and your duties. But the core of who I am is to be a priest and a deacon. And so a deacon, which is the first stage of ordination, it means servant. And it's quite beautiful in the ordination ceremony. I'm wearing a stole, and this stole is like a piece of fabric that drapes around my neck and down my body, represents a cloth that you wash people's feet with. So at the very beginning of my calling, of my vocation, I'm reminded that I'm first and foremost a servant. And there doesn't seem to be too much striving to move into different roles, in my opinion.
So what you're saying essentially is it's not like a promotion or anything. It's not as linear like that.
Yeah, correct.
Okay,
and it's interesting because there are churches all over the country, and each has their vicars and rectors and so forth. We all pretty much, I think, get paid the same. We get the same kind of provision for housing and things. But we have very different churches. I could have a church that's city centre that's got nearly 1,000 people, really big kind of corporation type church. Or I could be in a little village somewhere, tiny little parish church of 12 people. And it doesn't matter. Like, we recognize that's God's calling on your life, to serve that community. There's very little comparison. It really is a wonderful and very liberating place to be working, because when I was involved with law prior to doing all this stuff, very cutthroat, very competitive, very petty. Like, you wouldn't leave the office until your boss had left, or you'd leave a light on in your room with a frosted glass, so you hope they think you're still there.
When you said the stole you use for washing people's feet, is that like an analogy for something? Is that metaphorical?
Yeah, the scriptures, we read about how Jesus was preparing his disciples essentially to be the church on earth, and there are accounts of him where he washes people's feet. Back in that culture, that was a very lowly thing to do. So the disciples, one day, you go to someone's house and they can't believe, like, it just blows their mind that Jesus is washing a lowly person's feet. That's like totally countercultural. But that's who he was. That's what God was modeling, embodying through Jesus. And so as a priest, yes, symbolically, we're reminded that that's what we're to do. We're constantly reminded that we're here for people, and then they're not here for us. However, because of sin and human nature, we get this wrong, and we need to repent of that.
Can you tell us more about your calling that you mentioned? Can you tell us a story about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to studying in the UK, I was actually working in Hong Kong, and I was working at a church. So originally I went to Hong Kong back in 2005 to do law. And maybe I can talk about that later, about how I transitioned from law into working for the church. But anyway, I was working in this church with a number of friends, and it was growing. It was growing fast. And by 2016, we had almost 2,500 people in a congregation. And very few of us had theological education. And we talked earlier on about how it's important. So I came to the UK, as I said, to study theology. One of my possible intentions when I finished was to return to Hong Kong, to return to this church. But I've realized that I would have been welcomed, and I would have been upscaled, of course, I would have studied. But I'm actually still regarded as a foreigner in Hong Kong, because I was born in the UK, and culturally I'm probably very Western. And yet the leaders that we're raising up in Hong Kong are Hong Kong-born men and women who really understand the context, who really have a heart for what's going on. Do you see what I mean? Like, I definitely empathize and care, but I just don't have the depth of someone who is like from Hong Kong leading that church. And so I felt maybe I was part of the generation that helped plant the church, but maybe there's another generation that's going to make it, water it. So as I was having those doubts about should I return, in the UK I was doing discernment process, and it became clear to me that I'm now in a time in history where diversity and inclusion are really key kind of conversations in society. And so all of a sudden it's almost like God was saying, Mark, where you're probably going to be most useful is actually in the UK, not in Hong Kong. And this was really difficult for me to take, because growing up in the UK, I think I had a lot of racism. I had a really hard time growing up. So I had a lot of wounds, a lot of hurts. And so I had to go on a journey of confronting these hurts, because often you just try and avoid them. I had to allow God to heal me. I had to go through a process of confronting my hurts, my angers, my unforgiveness. And really it's a lovely journey of reconciling myself to my Chinese heritage, which I denied. And I felt that this was the area that God was drawing me, calling me into. So that's a bit about why I feel called to actually be in the UK and actually be in the Church of England.
Why did you choose Hong Kong to do your postgraduate?
You mean in law?
For law, yeah.
Yeah, so I did my undergrad, my law degree in the UK, but midway through my mother had cancer and she had it for a year before she passed away. So I took a gap year in 2002. So in 2002 I spent a year in Hong Kong, sofa surfing, backpacking. I was very broken. I'm an only child. I was a real mess. And actually, it was then that the friends who started the church that I was part of just came alongside me and just showed me love, took care of me. So when I finished my undergrad back in the UK, when I could go anywhere, I realized that God had provided like a support network in Hong Kong, opportunities in Hong Kong in terms of law. So yeah, it made sense to go there for my postgrad with the intention of doing law, but as it didn't quite work out that way. But I did return to Hong Kong for that.
Oh, thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you.
Why did you choose law to begin with at university?
Did I really choose it? When you're 16, you have to pick your A-levels.
Right.
I'm sure 16-year-olds are a lot more mature these days, but when I was 16, I hardly even knew how to dress well, and I was playing PS1. That was my major concern. So what happened was at GCSEs, I got pretty much straight A's.
Okay.
So,
nice.
Yeah, hurrah. The careers advisor, who now I think was a bit suspect, the careers advisor said, oh, you can do anything. You had straight A's. So I'm like, oh, I want to be a doctor, simply because I was watching a program called ER at the time. I'm 16, aren't I? Now, if my careers advisor had been any good, she would have realized that I'm much stronger, much more comfortable with the arts.
Okay.
But she didn't ask that. You had straight A's, so I had to take science, physics, and chemistry. So by the end of my A-levels, I clearly wasn't getting the grades I needed, which was, quite humbling at the time. So eventually I didn't get into any of the med schools I wanted to. I wasn't even sure I wanted to be a medic anymore, having hated chemistry. So I eventually actually went through clearing to try and get onto a law course, and I did, and it was a diploma. But I was head boy of my school, and I'm not kidding, my local newspaper published on the day of the A-level results, head boy of this comprehensive school fails.
Oh no.
Yeah, I'm not kidding. And so anyway, we complained, and do you know what happened the next day? Inside the paper, they're like, we are sorry for publishing an article saying that he failed. They repeated it. But anyway, I was pretty angry, but I worked so hard, I really plugged at it, that within a few months, they knew I was on the wrong course, and they put me straight onto the degree. And then I carried on. But I fell into it. I had no idea what I really wanted to do. Law seemed a decent one to get. Yeah, sorry, it's not very profound.
If it makes you feel any better, I think most 16-year-olds that pick their degree choice and major at that age, it's very rarely profound. I think it's hard to know what you want to do, and the pressure of your entire future, essentially, can be quite daunting and intimidating.
Yeah, and the other thing, we've talked about role models a little bit. About
yeah, right.
Back then, I didn't have any role models within the Church of England. Yeah, I don't think I really ever considered that might be something I want to do, even though I was going to church and passionate about it. Yeah, I think things are getting better now. Like even in the media and in entertainment, I see a lot more East Asian representation. And it's a really good thing, because I was in Hong Kong for like just under 15 years. And when I came back in 2016, like I actually noticed a difference. I remember before I left, I used to take photographs whenever I saw like a picture of someone East Asian in a magazine or on a billboard. Like I still have them. I used to take pictures on my 3 megapixel camera. But now I see faces like mine everywhere, increasingly. And I have 3 young children, and I know that they're growing up in a slightly different world, and I'm really pleased about that. But I want to see that reflected in the church as well.
Sure, yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about the transition you made from law to religion and some of the reasons that motivated you to make this transition?
Yeah, again, quite an entertaining story. I would say it happened because of love. So what happened was, when I was pursuing law in Hong Kong, I had a girlfriend and we were getting serious, and she basically said, I don't want to marry you if you become a lawyer. For her, family life was very important, and with the route I was taking, I wouldn't have much time. I'd be in the office all the time, working international time zones, waiting for documents to come through that you still have to sign. There are kitchenettes and showers in these places. We wouldn't have a life together. When she actually studied law and decided not to go with it in the end and follow her passion, which was teaching. So there was that. So there was this girl, who thankfully is now my wife. But the other thing is, I also wasn't enjoying law. It wasn't fulfilling me. I have friends and they love it, but I just wasn't enjoying it. And if I wasn't enjoying it, it becomes hard work.
Yeah.
And it was stressing me out. And then thirdly, I mentioned a church I was part of. It was still in the early days of the church. We'd only just managed to get our own premises. And I was just getting more involved. And that is where I was passionate. I was interacting with people I cared about, refugees, local Chinese. And so all of these things really, it made it a no-brainer. I don't think law's for me. However, it's still difficult letting it go, because you spend all those years training, and the financial rewards at the end are obviously very attractive.
Yeah.
But I just felt I need to be able to lay this down. And actually what's quite beautiful is when the day I proposed to my girlfriend, when I got on my knee, I technically didn't have a job that day. And we looked back together, and we realized that she said yes to me when I didn't have all of these things to offer her, these worldly things. And that has really helped us as I've stepped out in faith to be with the Church of England. I really am indebted to my wife. I know she's for me, she's supporting me, that we're in this together. Yeah. So it wasn't too difficult to leave in the end. But the training I did has proved really helpful in what I do, even today.
Just wondering how that's helped you.
So with the nature of working with the Church of England, it's an established church, it does cross over into other sectors of society. And so when I am having to navigate some of these areas, legal skills and understanding is really helpful. For example, when you're part of the C of E, you already have a relationship with your diocese, with your council, perhaps with some of the public health services. They're already built in. And you have to know how to engage with these people respectfully, responsibly. And again, when I was training for law, these are skills you have to pick up and learn. And also, as the church engages with issues of social justice, we can try and help directly, but a lot of the issues are legal frameworks that are prejudiced, that are preventing equality and things. So being able to bring some of my knowledge and experience to that, I think, is really constructive.
Okay.
And really helpful. To be able to provide a voice even for those who aren't heard, or to point them in the right direction to help them.
A question relating to interpretation. So in classical music, there's a lot of different editions of scores. So the most accurate edition that most people use, that most people praise, is the Urtext edition, which is the edition that's closest to the composer's intentions. And you have these other editions that are completely inaccurate, all the markings and stuff like that. And I've heard from debates on YouTube, like they always mention King James Bible as the most revered out of all the versions. Can you talk about all the different versions of the Bible. So you have King James, and are there any other lesser known versions of the Bible?
Yeah, this isn't my area of expertise, so if anyone's listening and I'm getting it wrong, I stand to be corrected. But yes, there are many different interpretations of the Bible, and yeah, there's a lot of argument that the King James is the most accurate and all this stuff. But I think actually, if you really want to understand and interpret the Bible accurately, you need to go back to the original languages. So in my college, you could study Hebrew, and then study Greek. So really, I'm not really interested in discussing whether the New Living Translation or the New International Version or the King James is more accurate. I think if you are really concerned with preaching accurately and interpreting accurately, you do need to spend time studying. And so that's why a lot of priests and ministers generally go to Bible school, so that they can bypass these kind of surface arguments and really get down to what was being said, not just in the language, but in the context. What was the cultural context and what was being said? And what's interesting, I think, just bringing things back to British Chinese orientation, that in the world of the New Testament, it was very much an honor-shame society, community. Now, in the West, we're not so much big on honor and shame. It's more about kind of freedom and guilt. And that has informed how people have read their Bibles. That's what they're looking out for. That informs then how they preach it and teach it and so forth. But one of the things that I think East Asian theologians and scholars can bring to build up the church is this perspective of honor and shame. Because when you read the New Testament with those lenses on, it actually makes a lot more sense. And as you draw from it, interpret it, it's probably more accurate to how the author originally intended to write it. Yeah, interpretation is really key, is really important. And that's why, looking at current affairs, we've just had Trump's supporters storming Congress. And I don't know I saw on the BBC a lot of Christians, so to speak, evangelical Christians saying, God reigns and all this stuff. And I just think, given what we've just discussed, it's really important to take into account, or to realize how they are interpreting the scriptures. And is it correct? Is it not? Yeah, I think we have to be very wary around a lot of the people who are using their faith to justify political ends and means. But that shows the dangers of interpreting too rashly, or interpreting without critiquing who's teaching you these things.
Do you have any favorite Bible passages that resonate with you?
That's like asking someone if they have a favorite song. Depends on what day it is. The Bible is so rich, and it's really hard for me to distill just obviously the fullness of Jesus in a single verse or passage. But maybe I'll share a passage that I'm currently reflecting upon. And what's the date? Yeah, it's mid-January right now. So we are still in the season of Epiphany. So the church calendar has different seasons, and Epiphany comes straight after Christmas, which celebrates how Jesus is now present and revealed to the world. And the classic Epiphany scripture is about the three magi in Luke. And the reason that I think this is quite interesting for us, particularly those of us who are British Chinese, is if you read the narrative, it says that the star was visible in the east. And this really interests me because straight away we can see that the knowledge of Jesus Christ is found in the east. So we were talking about cultures earlier on. So straight away we can't just discount other cultures. There's wisdom in them, okay? And secondly, it says that they followed, and I quote, his star. So we're not just following any star, but they're following the light of, as a Christian, of Christ. So again, there's a knowledge of Jesus Christ coming from foreign nations. That's really important for us to grasp so that we don't just discriminate them because they're different. What I think is really interesting is obviously they visit the Christ child, but in the narrative, the same providence that guided them to Jesus guides them to bypass the King Herod, Jerusalem. And so when I think about this, that the divine providence is having them bypass the institutional center, interestingly, of God's people. So you could interpret that as the church. So these foreigners who bring the good news continue to spread the good news, the gospel, without necessarily going through the church. Now, I think this is really interesting. Now, I'm obviously for the church. I've signed up to be a priest within the church, but I think it's a real good warning that The church can't monopolize what God, by his Spirit, is doing in the world. And actually, we have to be careful. The church can be corrupt, and maybe it's a good thing that they didn't go through the institution, because if they did, it could have been colonialized, and it could have gone out telling people you've got to sound and look like me and have my cultural values. So I just think that story of the three magi, I find it really interesting and really encouraging for those of us who are different, who might be considered foreigners in this place. We actually have something really positive to bring. And I really hope that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is attuned to hearing these voices from other places. Yeah, so that's something that I'm tripping out over right now.
Thank you for sharing that.
No, not at all.
You mentioned that God called on you to embrace and not neglect either side of your identity. Did you ever have trouble with identity growing up as a British-born Chinese in the UK?
Yeah, I think I look back, I think I really struggled. I think I probably even have some trauma, if I'm to be honest, reading some psychological books. I was brought up in a very predominantly white neighbourhood school in Wales. And as a young kid, I just wanted to fit in. So to fit in was I was embarrassed. So I remember we used to have to bring our lunch into school, and everyone would open up their lovely, perfectly cut square sandwiches with no crust and apple and crisps. My parents, because they loved me, would give me a big fat thermos flask full of congee or noodles. So I'd be in class on a rainy day, because normally ate outside. I'd crack it open, right? And then someone across the room would go, "Oh, what's that smell? Something's died." So I'd kind of screw back my thermos. I wouldn't eat it. I'd go home really hungry. That was just, and then another occasion, and this one's quite serious really. I was a bit older as a teenager at high school, and I'm walking down the road to school with my best friend. This is my best friend. And I decide to share with him something very intimate. This is a real test of trust. I'm going to tell him who I fancy. As a teenager, this is a big deal. And I said, "I fancy," I won't say her name in case she's listening. I doubt it. I said her name. "I like this girl." And without breaking stride, my best friend, who I grew up with, just goes, "Oh, she wouldn't go for you. You're Chinese." He said that without any malice, without any intention to hurt me. It was just matter of fact, right? And from that moment, I was only like 13. I think that caused a massive scar on me. I just felt I have nothing to offer the opposite sex. I'm just not desirable. Chinese men are not desirable. And I had a real low self-esteem from that problem. And I'd still join in the banter when a really pretty girl would walk in, all that kind of stuff. But deep down, I'm like, but that's off limits for me. And all the Chinese people I knew, apart from my parents, were related to me as well. I had to call everyone auntie and uncle. So I never really knew how to engage with people. It wasn't until university. And that's actually when I met my girlfriend, who eventually became my wife. So we met in the UK. That I suddenly met some people who weren't white, who were normal and attractive. This can't be right. Chinese people aren't attractive, are they? But I'm finding them attractive, and maybe I have something to offer too. So yeah, I had real identity issues. And I think, coping strategies to fit in. As part of my training here as a priest, we have to do a CMES profiling. It's like personality tests, like Myers-Briggs and stuff. And what was really interesting in the session when we came out was I happened to be one of the very few, the only one actually that day, who was one of the 3% who can comfortably navigate any one of the 4 quadrants of personality type. And as I reflected on it, I think the trainer said he has learned to do this because he is a minority. He has had to learn from being a kid to survive, to fit in really well. He's consciously self-aware all the time. So yeah, I think growing up, it was difficult. I can see some of the positives that came out of it, but not all come out of it positive. I have a number of Chinese friends who I think were really scarred and suffer depression because of it, or have withdrawn themselves from society, or don't realize their full potential. They keep looking down on themselves. They don't ever imagine or dream that they could be a head of a company or on the screen presenting. They just can't see it in themselves. Yeah, it was tough growing up.
I'm really sorry to hear about what your best friend said. That's quite awful. But I like what you said about adapting, because I don't think I adapted very well. I became quite withdrawn and my social skills took quite a hit, as you rightly said could happen. So it's really interesting to hear that you went the opposite way and learned to adapt to navigate all four quadrants. Would you mind telling us your Myers-Briggs personality type?
I haven't done it for years.
Right.
The last time I did it, I was ENFP, so quite extroverted, driven. But I think that is more of the facade that I put up. I think it's my secondary kind of thing. I think I'm probably more introspective, if I'm to be honest. And actually, I'm in some discussions right now examining the usefulness of these tests in the Church of England in terms of ethnic minorities. So when I last did this profiling, they often say these are the positives and these are the negatives. When I was sitting there listening to the negatives of red, and I'm hearing that these traits are like negative and undesirable, that makes me feel really rubbish, because these are the type of traits or characteristics that I have to rely on just to be heard, to be taken seriously, to be treated equally. I have to be outspoken to be heard. Things like that. I don't mean to generalize. But what it did was it got me on a journey of thinking, gosh, even these have categories that exclude people who are different, from different cultures. And so this needs to be addressed. Yeah, just one of my reflections on identity. And so I'm on a journey. I think I still am learning to accept myself fully. I'm not the finished product at all. I still find myself sometimes going, oh, that's really Chinese. And I suddenly realize I'm using Chinese almost like a cuss word, like it's not very good. Where did that come from? And that came up from my upbringing. And these are things that I need to keep working through.
Would you mind sharing with us your coping strategies when you were growing up? Because I know a lot of people have their very own unique coping strategies depending on the environment they were in as a child, as a teenager as well. Can you elaborate for us your coping strategies?
Sure. I think some of the vocabulary that's helpful is found in America with Asian American studies. And that's this term model minority. And really it's a myth. But the myth of the model minority is that you put your head down, you fit in, you assimilate to be included, and therefore you are more acceptable than other minorities. And it's almost a bit of a flattery. You think, this is great. Society doesn't like these ethnic groups because of X, Y, and Z. The Chinese, they're cool, they're quiet, hardworking, they made paper and gunpowder, good food. And that's probably what I subscribed to and worked towards, to being accepted. But as I look back on that, so that's what I did, it wasn't helpful, because it puts pressure on East Asians to try and fit, this type to be a model minority. And also it puts down others. And ultimately it's all, in my opinion, it's all a result of white normative, right? What white being the norm, being the acceptable, and everything else having to work around that kind of paradigm. But as a kid, you just do what you do to fit in. There are two words that I think are helpful. They're inclusion and embrace. So there's an author called Miroslav Volf who wrote Inclusion and Embrace, and he basically says we can try and include people, but that means they have to conform to who you are and what you do. So in the church, we're quite good at including people. They come along no matter who you are, but we're not really embracing them. I look at myself in the C of E. I'm quite easy for them to embrace because I can speak the lingo, I can work the room, I can come across and endear myself because I'm able to, because of my opportunities. But if I was Chinese who wasn't brought up here, that'd be so much harder, wouldn't it? I don't think the Church of England can pat itself, or any organisation can pat itself on the back too hard for including people, who are like me. I'm quite easy to integrate. But are we really loving to the extent that Jesus kind of models for us? Is it radical love? I'm willing to embrace you even though you're different, even though it's uncomfortable. And at my old church, we used to say, we comfort the afflicted and we afflict the comfortable. Now, these are really uncomfortable things to talk about, but unless we confront them, there will always be all these divides and barriers in our society.
So previously you've said that you felt God call on you to embrace both sides of your British Chinese identity. I appreciate this could be quite an intimate experience, but would you mind sharing with us what that calling felt like?
That's a difficult question to answer. It's so big. Okay, we've just discussed how I've had to cope and almost try and fit in, or always conforming myself to what I felt other people's expectations or perceptions were.
Sure.
But I think over the last few years, I've learned not to be so afraid to discovering who I really am. My being Chinese is an important part of me. We're not just brains, we're also bodies. God created me from my voice to the color of my skin, to the wave of my hair, whatever it is. And I really feel that true healing and acceptance of yourself comes from accepting all of these things. But it's been so hard to do that in the UK for me. And I'll call it a journey, because it's really hard to do, because even now I sometimes still find it hard to accept certain parts of myself because I've rejected them for so long. And yeah, I've started looking into my heritage, my culture. Like, I knew nothing about Chinese culture, and I've just discovered things like, this is a really funny one, fiber optics was made in Hong Kong. I'm proud of that. Like, the world's connected because some person in Hong Kong had the idea to put mirrors inside a cable and use that to transmit information. That's amazing. You know, there are so many good things. And actually, it's not just Chinese culture, but I'm learning from other cultures. And as I learn intimately, like, just the amazing good things about those cultures, I find that it helps me be less prejudicial and less judgmental. So I'm learning to be less prejudicial against myself, against people who are Chinese, who look like me, I think. And I think there's a really interesting dynamic. I was talking to the head of Asian American Studies in Fuller College in the United States. His name's Daniel. And he was saying that because we're brought up in a white normative education environment, all of the terminologies we use, the language we use, is for white norms. And so we are unable to articulate the experiences of being British Chinese. So right now, this is why I'm struggling to answer your question. Mm-hmm. You can hear me stuttering a bit. I don't think I have the language to fully express my experience yet. And this is why the Asian American Center of Studies has been running for almost 50 years now to help Asian Americans, so the equivalent would be British Chinese, to find their identity, their place in society, to reconcile their phenotype, so their color, to reconcile their cultural heritage, to reconcile their Western experience. All of these things give you a lens. It's like a prescription for glasses. And once you have the language, you can then understand and articulate. But right now, I'm still partially sighted. I can't quite seem to recognize or articulate my condition. And that's why there's so much trauma. I'm trying to use Western vocabulary, categories and norms to express my situation. And of course, it doesn't work. And so this is why diversity in even academia and education is so important. We need to discover these languages so we can tell each other's stories and therefore understand each other. But right now it's just a babble. There's misunderstanding, there's fallout all the time. We don't understand each other, which is why we get frustrated and push against each other. Yeah, I'm sorry it's not very coherent, but even now, I'm struggling to find the language to express my experiences as a British-born Chinese in the West.
I find it so interesting that you mentioned the absence of appropriate language for ethnic minorities to articulate their experiences. I think once we find a common language to express our struggles and reality, our next generation might be in a better position to be in this world. They might not have to go through the same struggles we went through. You just joined the COVID anti-racism group. Can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. A few months ago, I came across a group online. I just saw it on Facebook called the COVID-19 Anti-Racism Group, so CARG, C-A-R-G. I think it's set up in London, and it's a bunch of people of mostly Chinese heritage who have basically identified the incredible spike in anti-Chinese racism since the pandemic began. In October, an MP called Sarah Owen went to Parliament and had the first discussion on racism against East Asians. So it's quite historical. She had that debate, and listening to it, and she's done the research and others have, hate speech has risen by 900% against East Asians since the pandemic. Acts of violence have increased by 300%. So this is more than any other kind of ethnic group. And given the rising influence of China and possible BNO passport holders coming over, I can foresee that racism is probably going to get worse, could potentially get worse against East Asians. And again, we've talked about phenotypes today. People don't don't necessarily differentiate if you're Japanese, Korean. They'll just think, oh, you're all China virus, and so to speak. But what's really interesting, and I haven't shared this yet, but I really like sci-fi. I love sci-fi. I think it's because it asks questions about existential things, really. But anyway, it dawned on me that all the sci-fi I like, it paints a picture that's normally dystopian and very Asian. So if you look at Blade Runner, Matrix, Minority Report, all the billboards are like Chinatown. They have neon signs, Chinese culture. But what I discovered was this type of sci-fi came out in the 50s and 60s in America when the Japanese automobile industry was growing and taking over. So it was a reaction, a fearful reaction to East Asian dominance in market forces. So it's fear-based, and it's the yellow peril. And so all of this fiction, which captures people's imagination, starts painting a world of fear. Look at the future. It's dark, it's dystopian, and look, the Asians culturally have taken over. Now, I find that really interesting because we're talking about prejudices, right? And the role of the media. And there's this, you watch these movies and you often find that humanity has come together, black and white and brown, and they all speak kind of American English. But who are the perpetual foreigner? They bring in the human being who has like an East Asian accent. Even our wildest imaginations for the future, they other people who look like me. They other East Asians. And I think this is quite serious. I know it's media and we can have some fun. There's a scene in Blade Runner where Harrison Ford is tasked with hunting down replicants who aren't really humans. And one of the tests is he asks her about which food she's going to eat. And the test is, if she decides to eat the Asian food, dog meat and stuff, she's clearly not human. She's a replicant. Can you hear this constant message through one of the most famous sci-fi movies? And this is just consistent throughout the media. And again, this group, CARG, they have some really great people who are tracking things in the media. And we've even noticed how certain prominent news websites, I don't want to name them, often when they're reporting on COVID, will feature an East Asian face in a mask, even if it's completely unrelated to the East Asian community. Again, some of the research has shown that this media representation of East Asians is contributing to the rising increase in hate violence and hate speech. And so to be asked to just contribute to the COVID anti-racism group, it's a real honour, actually. And I really hope, as someone who has one foot in the church, that the church can contribute to some of this, because the church is here to serve society. But yeah, it's all coming together. We discussed my calling. I really feel that God has created me, fashioned me, allowed me to go through all my experiences so that these are areas that I might contribute to constructively and hopefully just make things better for British Chinese in general, if and where I can. And being part of this podcast too is such an honour, guys, that you asked me to be part of this, that you're doing this, that you're raising the profile of all of these different issues. I'm really looking forward to hearing other episodes on this podcast. So all power to you guys.
Thank you so much.
The honour's all ours.
So there we have it, the first episode of the Open Door podcast. Reverend Mark Nam was great to talk to. His comments at the end there really meant a lot, especially coming from someone that's so actively trying to help make things better for British East Asians like us.
Yeah, and this episode really changed the way I see religious titles. It turns out ambitions in the religious world are not the same as the ones in the secular world. For example, for most people, the aim is to move up the ranks and to be promoted to a higher position. But for Mark and possibly other people in similar religious roles, the aim is to help people as much as they can, and the title isn't relevant like it is in the secular world.
And even though I'm not religious, just for context, I attended a Catholic convent school, and this episode really made me look back at my time there with a different lens and realise things slightly differently. Particularly what he said about needing to go back to the original languages to interpret the Bible accurately. Obviously, I did a lot of Bible reading at that school, and I think I just took things a little bit too literally. So things didn't really make sense. which is probably why I'm not religious today.
Yeah. And don't you think his story from law to priesthood is really remarkable?
Yeah. I don't think many people make that transition. I mean, I haven't heard of many people.
Yes, it's the first time I've heard of this transition, and the loss of his mother during this time, it was incredibly heartbreaking to hear, but also very inspiring how he pushed on with his friend's support during this time.
Yeah, and it kind of set him on this journey to where he got to today, which is really interesting. And I also really like how his cultural identity is interlinked with his calling from God.
Yeah, he makes an interesting point about him being able to navigate the 4 quadrants of MBTI. It's almost like a surviving mechanism as an ethnic minority, possessing many traits to fit in wherever you go. And I think it's something I can relate to too, because I myself did it quite often growing up in the UK.
Yeah, but I'm glad that we've got such a great guy representing us British East Asians in the Church of England.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you to all those listening if you made it this far. We hope you enjoyed episode 1 as much as we enjoyed making it. Episode 2 will be out same time next week. Please leave comments if you have any, and feel free to get in touch with us on social media. Links will be in the description. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.